Well, looks like the journey has come to an end. This day, 1684 years ago, Constantine, which we have followed already a few times on these history lessons, died of sickness, and he leveled up throughout his political career from Constantine to Constantine the Great. He was also the first Roman emperor to come out of the closet, to admit and confess his Christianity. Indeed, he was affected by Christianity. Even while being affected, he was still smart enough, hold on being baptized, to wait until the days before his death to undergo baptism, because this way he could be absolved from as many sins as possible before death. So a well-felt goodbye, one of the more important and impactful emperors of the Roman Empire, of the later half. Anyways, what we are talking about today is going back to something that we have left behind for some of the news that have been coming in for 9.1. We have had to check them one after the other, and we left out our series, our episodes of what to play in 9.1, what to choose, what to look for. So in this episode, what we are looking for is going to be more raid focused. It's going to be with a mindset of you wanting to get into raiding or continue raiding, but you're bored or disappointed on the class or the spec that you have chosen. So you're looking for something else without necessarily being too interested in other types of content, particularly, namely, since we're talking about PvE, Mythic Plus. So you don't really care too much about whether or not the spec you're looking into also needs to be good in Mythic Plus. You don't really plan on pushing Mythic Plus to any extent. You are part of a guild. You have some friends, I know, crazy, but you do have anyways a group that you can go with in Mythic Plus anyways. Maybe you don't even care about Mythic Plus and you're just doing your weekly 15 or your weekly 14 or whatnot, so you don't really need any sort of meta or flavor of the month spec to do this. Or maybe you do. Maybe you do care about Mythic Plus, but you're just a Chad and you're convinced that even if you play Demonology, even if you play Arcane, you're still going to get your groups. Either way, the focus of today is going to be on raiding. Now, contrary to popular belief, what makes a raid spec strong isn't just how much damage they do, or how much healing, what have you. Otherwise, this type of videos would be very short. Hey guys, let's look at which specs you should play in 9.1. Here are the top 2 Ranged DPS specs in damage, and here are the top 2 melee DPS specs in damage. Thank you and goodbye. The video is over. There are many situations where certain specs are doing much better than others. In damage, they are performing much better, yet they are 2, 3, maybe even 4 times less played than other specs, then they are outperforming. Because there are other elements you take into account when you're raiding. You have the composition of melee versus ranged, which favors the ranged. You have the raid buffs and debuffs that you have to cover with the various different specs and classes in your raid. You also have sometimes things like immunities, things like mobility, mechanics that need to be covered by certain specs and certain specs only, which is why many times just looking at the damage a spec does, if you are DPS anyways, it's not really telling the whole story. To give you an example right now, if you looked at the popular specs, Havoc is very popular, it's very played. It is effectively the 3rd most played melee DPS spec. Yet, Retribution Paladin, Windwalker Monk, Outlaw Rogue, Assassination Rogue, Frost Death Knight are all outperforming Havoc by quite a decent margin, without even touching the 2 specs that are already more popular, which are Fury and Unholy. There are 5 other specs currently outperforming Havoc, and yet Havoc is beating them in representation by quite a bit, even by 2 or 3 times as many players. Similar could be said about Marksmanship Hunters, still being very, very popular despite their fall in performance recently. So it's not just about the damage, it's not just about how strong their damage profile is. That being said, this was just to sugarcoat it to specs with some inferiority complexes. The amount of damage you're doing is still, at the end of the day, the most important part of your DPS spec. It can only be changed by a little bit in the damage profile. Sometimes having lower damage but a very good burst is going to beat having more damage but it is more average and more consistent, because certain fights, certain phases of certain fights will require burst. So you will overlook a spec having some lower damage than average if they have very powerful burst. Now, we have left this type of analyzing to quite a few weeks ago. This was the state a few weeks into 9.0.5, over a month and a half ago. And compared to what it is now, there isn't really much change. So it's not that we are learning something new. By showing you this, you're not really learning anything new. The top specs have remained the same. The only addition has been, compared to previous months, the only addition has been Assassination Rogue, and the bottom specs have also been more or less the same. The thing to look towards 9.1 is mostly the changes, the patterns and the trends of these specs with the professed and planned buffs and nerfs that Blizzard is planning for 9.1. Why? Because when you look at the top specs, the specs that you will be looking for normally when you want to respec, many people go this way. Many people take the blue pill and decide to believe that destruction is going to be OP. Maybe they will take the hunter route and they will have a great time for marksmanship for a while, but then it all goes sideways. So they are looking for another spec to play. And what do? They go to Warcraft logs, they start looking at the damage, and they're like, great, Balanced Druid, Shadow Priest, Affliction Warlock, or Fire Mage. That's what Warcraft logs is going to tell you when you're looking at a powerful spec to play. The good thing, because this keeps things interesting, this keeps people getting baited, the good thing is that many times this doesn't show you the minute-by-minute update on what is going on. And what is going on currently is that all these 4 specs are getting nerfed, are going to become weaker in 9.1, they are going to lower the bar, they are going to lower the ceiling of top damage for specs because the top specs are getting nerfed, which is good. That's what you want to see, right? From Blizzard. You want to see the specs at the top becoming nerfed so the ones below them can catch up, can be more competitive. When we're looking at the more and better performing specs, this is the outlook. Now, what about the buffs and what about the nerfs? What is changing? You have these 3 specs as the only ones being given a nice little help from Blizzard, although all 3 of these specs being changed received these changes already. These are 9.0.5 or previous buffs. They're not getting buffed in 9.1. Assassination has received a series of buffs in the past months to make it go to the point that it is now, which is the better performing melee DPS spec. Then you have Fury Warrior, which has followed a similar path of buffness over the past few months. And then you have Elemental, which hasn't really gotten a series of buffs. They just got one, a big comprehensive buff to their consistent AoE in 9.0.5. So those were the bonuses. The maluses, the nerfs, were to the other 5 in here, with their red bars stating more or less the significance of the nerfs. Unholy, as we have just covered literally a couple of days ago, the nerf was centered, or pretty much the nerf was just about anti-magic zone. As I mentioned, DPS specs sometimes are not always about damage, are not always about how much damage they do. As a proof, Unholy was nerfed in damage quite a few times since the release of the expansion. They have gotten way more in line compared to other melee specs. However, they still retained very respectable burst damage, which is very valuable, and also anti-magic zone, which is what kept them afloat most of the time. And this is getting nerfed in 9.1, so it's a pretty significant nerf. The other spec being nerfed, but not as much, is gonna be Shadow Priest. This is always very sketchy, is always very risky. When you're playing Shadow Priest, you're starting to sweat a little bit, even when you're playing any of these other hybrid specs that do not have an alternative. When you're getting targeted by Blizzard nerfs, is always very scary. Shadow's nerfs, they are nerfs, but they are not as bad as the rest. So at least that's a silver lining. Shadow Priest has been detected by Blizzard as being way too high on single target damage. So they are trying to change back to what Shadow Priest used to be, which was a dot cleaving, spreading dots everywhere, doing damage with your dots type of build, by nerfing Devouring Plague, which is their finisher, and buffing their dots. This is overall a nerf unless you're finding your niche perfect fight where you have multiple adds, multiple dots that can offload the nerf of your Devouring Plague in favor of the buffs to your dots, but it is going to be, in general, a nerf. And then you have the 3 actual nerfs. The Balanced Druid, the Affliction Warlock, and the Fire Mage. Affliction Warlock has gotten a similar treatment to Priest in the sense that their Malefic Rapture, their finisher, was nerfed in favor of buffing their dots, but this is hurting Affliction way more than it is hurting Shadow Priest. And then you have Balance and Fire. All nerfs we have gone over already, balance to their legendary, to their burst, as well as their constant Starfall AoE, which is the reason why they have been first in overall damage for pretty much the start of the expansion, because of Starfall. Followed by Fire Mage, which has also gotten a bunch of different nerfs. 10% nerf to their AoE damage of Flame Strike and Flame Patch. They have gotten the nerf to the strongest conduit in the game, Infernal Cascade, together with a nerf of their combustion cooldown by 15-ish to 20 seconds by nerfing Kindling. So pretty heavy and hefty nerfs for Fire Mage. So in having a chance of playing a spec that might be viable, this looks promising. You're like, well, if before I wasn't playing any of these specs, I basically wasn't being favored to get a spot in the raid. That's just how it is. The only one that's missing from here is marksmanship, and then you have just closed the representation of range specs, basically. So if all these specs are getting nerfed, then it means other specs might have a higher chance of making it in. After all the specs that are not here are alternatives of these, because what's missing is Destruction and Demonology, and they are bringing the same things to the raid that Affliction can when it comes to things like Soulstone or Hearthstone or Portals. Same can be said for Mage with Arcane and Frost, all bringing the Arcane Intellect buff as well as the Ice Block. Melee DPS is more of the uncharted territory. It's more of a wild land, because with Unholy getting the nerf of AMZ, it opens up these windows for things like Retribution Paladin, Windwalker Monk, you have Enhancement Shaman, maybe you have Frost Death Knight, maybe there is more space for Assassination to become more relevant, because despite their damage, they are still pretty unpopular as a spec. So it looks promising, at least when it comes to damage, the profiles, given these nerfs. What needs to be taken into account, however, when you start looking at raid composition is, of course, the buffs that you need to have for your raid, right? The puzzle that you need to finish, the Tetris line you need to fill of all the buffs and debuffs for your raid. And this, unfortunately, for everyone involved, is where tanks come into play. Because we have mentioned this point multiple times already, which is that tanks are going to make up a big part of what you want to bring as a DPS, particularly as a melee DPS. Because, of course, tanks off specs are pretty much in every case a melee spec, a melee DPS spec, except for Druid, which also has balance. Everyone else, you have Havoc and Vengeance, you have Windwalker and Brewmaster, you have Ret and Protection, you have Unholy and Frost with Blood, Feral with Guardian, and then Fury and Arms with Protection. So basically tanks go hand in hand with which melee are you playing. So yes, despite melee DPS actually looking pretty open in what you might play in 9.1, you have the issue that what doesn't look open is Vengeance and Brewmaster being your tanks for 9.1. This creates the issue that Vengeance is giving you the Demon Hunter debuff and that Brewmaster is giving you Monk debuff, the physical and the magical damage you can put on the enemies, which means there is less incentive to bring a Havoc Demon Hunter, there is less incentive to bring a Windwalker Monk. So it is certainly not doing many favors to the specs of their respective class, because they won't really get their free, comfy raid spot just because they are needed for the debuff, because the tanks are already covering it. Now, if you wanted the boring and very simple answer, is that playing a hybrid spec is always very dangerous. If you're planning on playing a melee DPS spec with the goal of getting into raiding, deciding to play something like Windwalker, something like Retribution, and something like Enhancement or even Feral is peak hipster. You have no backup, you have no alternative, you are bringing also with a bunch of these, pretty much all of these, with the exception of Windwalker, you're not even bringing a buff yourself, something that you might be needed for. And as I mentioned, even if you did bring a buff like Windwalker, you are almost certainly going to find a Brewmaster tank anyways, so it's not going to be that necessary for you to be here, which leaves us with a more boring answer that rogues are looking pretty good. Rogues have gotten unironically pretty outshone and overshadowed by Unholy DK in this expansion, at the start of this expansion, and even at the end of the previous expansion, while keeping a pretty good, pretty solid stronghold in Mythic Plus due to the Shroud and the overall damage an Outlaw Rogue can do in Mythic Plus. In raids, they weren't nearly as popular and powerful. Their uniqueness of bringing a cheat death, and Cloak of Shadows immunity was actually very powerful in Legion. That's when rogues were also doing very good damage together with this type of utility toolkit. After that, ever since BFA, they started dropping more and more in representation compared to other specs. It has gotten way more varied when it came to melee representation, which is good. It's good for everyone. And this expansion was following a similar note. This expansion, the Thugo melee spec was Unholy. Even after Unholy, you have started seeing Fury Warrior rise up a lot. Even now, where Assassination has been technically the strongest performing melee DPS spec for months, they are still nowhere near the more popular spec in the melee roster, like by a long shot. And now that Unholy is getting nerfed together with Frost because of anti-magic zone, it frees up the possibility of Rogue becoming high priority again as well, because their damage has gone unchecked when it comes to Outlaw. Outlaw was doing okay damage and is continuing to do okay damage, but more importantly, yes, you have had to pay. You have had to pay with losing Subtlety Rogue to the Nether. They disappeared as a playable spec in PvE, but you have benefited from Assassination being buffed. So now, not only do you have Outlaw, which is just fine and playable, you also have Assassination, which is overperforming by a long shot, has gotten a round of buffs, and has no nerfs on the horizon so far in 9.1. And as mentioned, you fully benefit from being a pure DPS class and having multiple specs that you can move around in. Yes, technically you're not actually playing the same Covenant for the same specs, so it's not that it's gonna be that easy to just hop between specs, but at least you have that option. Changing a Covenant is nowhere near the level of importance and also time required to changing classes altogether, like a poor hybrid spec would have to do. So my safe suggestion, if you're looking at playing something in 9.1 when it comes to melee DPS, is to look into Rogue a little bit. I feel like with the loss of Unholy's grip, no pun intended, on the melee DPS roster, given the nerfs to AMZ, rogues are going to have more priority now. I just cannot buy the stocks of Ret, I cannot buy the stocks of Windwalker, Feral, Enhancement, and all this clump in the middle, simply because they don't bring anything, and the only thing they bring, I will repeat again, is already brought by very popular tanks. So maybe if Brewmaster was getting gutted, I was like, well, you know what, Windwalker is performing pretty well. They will be the new ones to bring you the debuff, so they're gonna rise in popularity. Unfortunately, Brewmaster is not getting gutted. Unfortunately for Windwalkers, at least. So there is really no reason to see Windwalker rising. And the other class I would keep an eye out is on Warrior. Because Fury has not gotten nerfed in 9.1. There is nothing looking like a possible nerf for Fury. Arms is getting buffed in 9.1. So Warrior is also in a pretty decent spot. Even better than Windwalker and even better than Havoc, because of course Protection Warrior is kind of dead, which means when you need the Rallying Cry, when you want a Battle Shout, you have to look for a DPS Warrior. So to that extent, Warrior is basically the first, only required and necessary spot in raids when it comes to melee DPS, because the only other two buffs you would want for melee DPS are brought by the two tanks you will likely be using. So for me, the Rogue and Warriors stocks in raid encounters in 9.1 are going to be looking pretty good. When it comes to Ranged DPS is of course much more of a question mark because of the amount of nerfs that are available on the scene right now. You are getting basically all of the 4 strongest range specs nerfed. You know they're getting nerfs, you know they're going to be doing less damage, however, we don't know precisely by how much. And also, at the end of the day, their damage profile, the way in which they want to do damage, doesn't seem to be changing, particularly for Fire Mage. They are still a combustion spec. The only one that might be slightly different is Balance Druid. The nerfs applied to their build might bring them to go away from Convoke the Spirits, to go Kyrian, in return also to go away from their nerfed legendary, so their burst damage profile is going to go away for a more standard and streamlined damage profile. That's the only one that could change. And if you wanted to guess what to play as a Ranged DPS spec for raid encounters, this is where it gets even riskier. As I mentioned, I'm not buying the stocks of Ret or Windwalker or Enhancement because they are hybrid specs, so you are on very thin ice on whether or not you can be viable. You only have one shot, one spec. For ranged is even worse because these are the specs that on top of having only one spec, they are also getting nerfed. At the very least, the melee DPS specs that are hybrids are not getting touched, basically. Ret, Windwalker, Enhancement, Feral are not really receiving nerfs of any kind, whereas Balance Druid and Shadow Priest are getting nerfed, and substantially, particularly for balance. So you would be stepping into very dangerous territory, going into 9.1 rolling or switching to a Balance Druid right as it's getting nerfed, and it's the only spec you can go for range in Druid. Same goes for Shadow Priest. So it is pretty dangerous. I am way more on edge when it comes to Balance Druid than Shadow Priest. I think Shadow Priest is in a better situation than Balance Druid is. They also have a more unique damage profile and more functional than Balance Druid. It does bode a little bit better for Shadow. When it comes to Affliction and Fire is of course much easier. Yes, sure, if you were a fan, yes, sure, if you were a fan of the specs, sucks to be you, but at the very least you're playing with two other specs available for you to go to, Demonology and Destruction for Warlock and Frost and Arcane for Fire Mage. So even with Affliction and Fire Mage receiving major nerfs, staying in the class is not as bad. Is not nearly as bad, and it doesn't look like a suicidal hipster option to say, oh, I'm gonna go Warlock in 9.1. Sure, Affliction is getting nerfed, but you have other options. What is true, however, is that those are question marks. You're just hoping at this point, you're completely high on Copium, assuming that because Affliction is getting nerfed, then surely Demonology and Destruction are going to rise up. But that is just wishful thinking. We have no actual certified proof that just because Affliction is nerfed, then Demonology will start outperforming a spec like Elemental Shaman. Talking about Elemental Shaman, that is going to be the risk of the season. You know, it's going to be the double or nothing type of spec, because Elemental Shaman, much like Shadow and much like Balance, is a hybrid. Elemental Shaman has no backup plan. However, the current plan of Elemental is to just be buffed, because they have gotten buffed in 9.0.5, they have gotten much better over time, even if it was just in the impression of the player base, because they had to wait for 1 month before they could get their best in slot legendary. So they started pretty badly the expansion, and then as soon as they got their best in slot, they started doing much better, and then 9.0.5 came in, and they started doing even better, and now we are crossing the threshold where we are entering 9.1, and there are no nerfs in sight for Elemental. It is the only ranged spec of the top specs that has not gotten nerfed. So obviously people are going to put 1 and 1 together, 2 and 2 together, and go, okay, well, if the top 4 specs are getting nerfed and the 5th spec is not getting nerfed, then obviously I will go the 5th spec. Now, listen, you should do this at your own peril. I am actually not going to shill and campaign and lobby for Elemental Shaman. I have already seen guildmates and a couple of friends who are actually rerolling to Elemental already. I have seen 2 Balanced Druids already on the process of rerolling to Elemental. I have seen an Affliction Warlock in the process of rerolling to Elemental, and a Fire Mage in the process of rerolling Elemental. So it seems to be a common thought process. If my Flavor of the Month spec is getting nerfed, I will just go down the list of Flavor of the Month specs and look at the first one that isn't getting nerfed. Balance? Nope. Shadow? Nope. Affliction? Nain? Fire Mage? Niet. Oh, Elemental. Alright, let's go. And I won't fault you for this reasoning. It is pretty logical, it is pretty sound. If you go and look at the other specs below Elemental that are kind of competing, you see things like Demonology and Arcane. But you're right, when's the last time you've seen Demonology and you've seen Arcane becoming Flavor of the Month and the main spec of the tier? Barely ever, right? So if you're planning to do this, you should be wary, at the very least, that you do not get a second chance. That at the end of the day, Elemental is quite immobile. At the end of the day, Elemental has no immunity, doesn't really fit all these mechanics that you see about soaking, about soloing certain soaks, about moving very quickly to do a certain mechanic, things that have been generally, historically occupied by Mage and Hunter. So just keep that in mind. In the exact opposite situation of Elemental, there is Hunter. Because Hunter is just as much on the downswing than Elemental Shaman is on the upswing. And the role reversal comes in the fact that Hunter is still the spec with mobility, is still the spec with immunity. So, despite being pretty down in damage, despite getting outscaled by quite a bit, as Marksmanship often does, deeper into the expansion, they still hold all the cards for being the spec in raid encounters that is gonna do all the dirty work, and you will want in the group because of that. So you can take your risk going Elemental purely because of their damage profile and the effectiveness that they have right now going into 9.1, or you could do the opposite and say, you know what, I trust in Hunters, even though their damage is low. We have very rarely gone through a tier in the expansions of WoW without Hunters being popular in raids. So I won't trust the charts, I won't trust the damage meters. I know deep in my heart that Hunters are still gonna be used in raid encounters, and I will find myself a spot anyways. If it were up to me, the suggestion would go to just stay Warlock or Mage, because they are the more popular of the classes when it comes to ranged, and they have the more options compared to the hybrid specs. And if you wanted to take the risk, then Elemental is fine, but also the reverse risk of taking a Hunter anyways, even if they are underperforming. Now, going to the role that we haven't touched on yet is healers. Now, when you look at the healers and you start looking at the popularity of the specs in raids, it is pretty misleading if you look at the overall numbers, simply because by this point quite a few bosses are getting pugged, and there are plenty of pugs for some reason, probably frustrated restoration druids and holy priests that cannot get into the higher ranked bosses, so they just flood the pugs. But when you look at things like the Natrius, it looks like this, right? There is Shaman basically having more players than Discipline, Restoration, Holy Priest and Mistweaver combined. Stone Legion Generals and Sludge Fist, basically the three more important bosses, have the same representation. It's essentially 4 healers, double Resto Shaman, 1 Holy Paladin and 1 Discipline Priest. That is usually the composition. The reason why it's harder to just guess which healers are doing well or not is because looking at the healing, like here, doesn't actually tell you anything. HPS is not a good representation of the performance of a healer at all, so it is kind of hard to just gauge which of the healers are going to remain popular. So in this case, you just have to default to the history of this game, at least for the past some 4 expansions. There is not enough proof, there is not enough evidence that you can use to support the notion, the theory, that damage reduction is not going to be required and necessary coming into the next raid. Restoration Shaman with Spirit Link, Holy Paladin with Aura Mastery, Discipline Priest with Barrier, and the multiple times nerfed Spirit Shell when it comes to absorbs are still going to be the necessary cooldowns you want to use as healers, much more so than things like Tranquility or Revival or Divine Hymn. So of course, those 3 healer specs are going to remain at the forefront of raid healing. So this really comes down more to just the popularity, to how many specs are available, because Restoration Shaman is more popular than maybe you might be thinking into playing Holy Paladin and playing Discipline Priest. Discipline Priest also has the benefit of having 2 healer specs, the only one of all healers that can change between Discipline and Holy, between 2 types of healers, which by the way also do very different things, so it's pretty good. And on top of that, you also have the benefit that Holy Priest is actually doing fine right now. They have been doing better and better over the tier, and as I mentioned already, as I'm convinced of already, in the past few expansions, this is the better version of Holy Priest. As I said, I am buying stocks of Holy Priest. I do believe they're going to be doing better in 9.1. Their reworked Symbol of Hope is looking pretty strong as a powerful cooldown. Yes, no proper actual damage reduction, but it's certainly better than what it was before. So my suggestion actually wouldn't be to play Resto Shaman, but it would be to play Priest over the other classes, which is why you see me in this video playing Paladin. That's right, I am listening to my own advice. And then lastly, when it comes to tanks, we have unfortunately already touched on this. Without Windwalker being exceedingly powerful and without Mistweaver being a playable spec, there is really no reason to not be playing Brewmaster tank. The strength of the tanks is so minor in raids, like the difference they have between each other, that having the right type of buff to bring or debuff to bring to the raid is just way more important. This is not like choosing between a Combustion Fire Mage or a Beast Mastery Hunter, because they can bring different things. This is just about the difference in tanks is nowhere near that level, particularly the lower you go in guild ranks, in world rankings. So Vengeance and Brewmaster seem intent on keeping this, because they are the ones who bring the debuffs. Prot Paladin and Guardian Druids don't really do anything for you. There has been the indirect nerf to Blood Decay. Yes, Anti-Magic Zone is now going to be stronger for Blood Decay than it is for Unholy and Frost, but it is still going to be something like a third of what it used to be, even if you're playing Blood, so it's still a nerf for you. And then you have Protection Warrior, which is the only one that can give you something cool, like a Shout, Battle Shout, or even Rallying Cry, but Fury Warrior is already performing pretty well as a melee DPS, so you don't really have a need to have a Prot Warrior. So it is definitely the least interesting and the least exciting of the roles. Any type of guess on what to play in 9.1 if you're a tank, and if you're looking into raiding, then the answer cannot not be Vengeance or Brewmaster. Because if Vengeance and Brewmaster have 1.5 times the number of logs than the other 4 tank specs combined, then you can't realistically just suggest playing them. Even when we are looking at 9.1, where we don't even have any major significant further nerfs to Vengeance or nerfs at all to Brewmaster. or buffs to Protection, Paladin and Warrior, as well as Blood Decay and Guardian Druid. So tanks definitely fall in the more boring and predictable answer, which is just keep playing what you've been playing since the start of this expansion, which is kind of boring. So now we have gone over all of the specs with a focus, with an eye on raid encounters. We're getting closer to the release of 9.1, so it's not that there is that much time for you to make this decision. I am certain that many people eventually will look back at the decision they made before playing and then curse their terrible decision making or their bad luck, just like you have done before Shadowlands, when you excitedly decided that this would have been the time for Enhancement Shaman, or this time for sure Demonology Warlock will shine, or maybe Feral is a hidden OP. Let's hope you're not doing the same mistake in this tier. I've tried helping you in what would be my logical picks when it comes to all the roles. For melee DPS, I would be looking at Rogue and Warrior in particular. When it comes to ranged, it's Warlock and Mage, purely because of the amount of option they have, although those options are not looking that hot right now. If you wanted to go for the risk of the possible high reward, then you could look into Elemental Shaman, but even Shadow Priest, believing that their nerfs not to be as bad as the rest. And when it comes to healers and tanks, for healers, just believe the oversaturation of Resto Shamans and the fact that Paladin and Priest are still catching up and required enough, necessary enough, that many guilds will still seek for those two classes over a Resto Shaman. And then tank is the more boring one and the more straightforward one, because Vengeance and Brewmaster seem to be clogging the raid spots for now when it comes to tanking. And we will eventually see which one of these suggestions ended up being true, because eventually we're going to get our raid compositions and our progression and our logs for 9.1. That being said, we are also getting eventually more balance tuning, so there is going to be more touches to specs and classes and legendaries and conduits and whatnot, so some of these things might change. We will of course continue reporting on them, seeing the changes that Blizzard plans to apply before the release of 9.1. For now, we can stop here. This has gone on for long enough. We will also eventually do a similar one for Mythic Plus, for the people more interested in Mythic Plus than they are in raid encounters. So thank you guys for watching the video. I don't know if you noticed, but as soon as you clicked on this video, you have become contractually obligated to also click on the subscribe button. Thank you for your cooperation. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I am still buying Holy Priest stocks, by the way. I'm fully committed, except actually playing one.